My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 32, founder of ElevateX Solutions. 6 years ago, I walked away from my father's company and everyone swore I'd come crawling back. Last weekend at my brother's wedding, my dad stood in front of 200 guests and called me the family's biggest disappointment. An hour later, they all watched me on live TV shaking hands on a $1 million deal. The warm salt air from the harbor brushed against my face as I stepped out of the car and onto the cobblestone drive leading to the Charleston Harbor Club. The place shimmered under strings of golden lights draped across the courtyard, their glow bouncing off the polished white columns and tall glass windows. Laughter spilled out from inside, mingling with the faint notes of a string quartet. I adjusted my tie, forcing a steady breath, and walked toward the entrance where a pair of hosts stood greeting guests. My polished shoes clicked against the stone, each step reminding me that tonight I was walking into enemy territory. Inside, the ballroom looked like something from a luxury lifestyle magazine. White roses floated in crystal bowls on every table, the scent of them mixing with the crisp tang of champagne. Tall windows overlooked the water where yachts bobbed quietly under the night sky. Men in tailored suits and women in gowns swept past me, some offering polite smiles, others giving me that quick, assessing glance I'd grown used to over the years. My chest tightened, not from nerves exactly, but from the awareness that most people here had already decided who I was and what I was worth. I spotted him almost immediately. My father, Robert Hayes, stood near the main table talking to the mayor with one hand resting on the back of my brother's chair. His silver hair was combed to perfection, his dark suit cut sharp enough to look expensive without seeming flashy. He looked up briefly, his gaze landing on me. There was no warmth in it, only the acknowledgement you'd give a stranger in passing. He gave the smallest nod, then turned back to his conversation. My throat went dry, but I kept my pace steady as I made my way to the table assignment board. The seating chart confirmed what I suspected. My name wasn't anywhere near the family table. Instead, I'd been placed at table 14, somewhere at the far end of the room near the dessert station. I bit back a humorless smile. Not surprising. At least it gave me a good view of the whole room, a vantage point to watch the choreography of my family's version of perfection. As I threaded my way between tables, I caught bits of conversation. A woman in a sequined navy dress whispered to her husband about how I'd left Hayes and Whitman Financial. Someone else mentioned hearing I'd been dabbling in something called a tech venture. Their tone made it sound like I'd taken up basket weaving in a basement. I didn't bother correcting them. Let them speculate. Truth had a way of revealing itself eventually. At table 14, I pulled out a chair and sat down. The couple across from me introduced themselves as friends of the bride's parents. They were kind enough, asking the usual polite questions, but I could feel their curiosity skimming just under the surface. I answered in short, easy sentences, smiling when appropriate, keeping my eyes on the stage at the front of the room. That was where the real performance would happen tonight. Across the sea of tables, my brother Jonathan stood beside his bride Emma, their hands intertwined as they leaned in to speak to guests. They looked happy, genuinely so, and despite everything, I hoped that part of tonight was real. Jonathan caught my eye for a brief second, gave me a quick grin, then turned back as someone tapped his shoulder. The lights dimmed slightly and the hum of conversation dropped. A man in a tuxedo stepped onto the stage with a microphone, his smile practiced but warm. He welcomed everyone, thanked the guests for being there, and then gestured toward my father. My pulse quickened, not from anticipation, but from the quiet certainty that I knew exactly what was coming. My father rose from his seat, buttoning his jacket, and walked up to the stage with the calm authority of a man who had always owned every room he entered. I sat back, my hands folded loosely on the table, and watched him take the microphone. His voice was smooth, the kind that carried even without effort. He began by speaking about the significance of the day, about love and family, about how proud he was of Jonathan and Emma. The guest listened intently, laughing at the right moments, nodding when he spoke of values and hard work. But I recognized the shift in his tone, subtle but sharp, the way his eyes scanned the crowd before lingering just a second too long in my direction. The air in the room seemed to tighten, the sound of clinking glasses fading to nothing in my ears. I knew the jab was coming. I could feel it like the slow build of thunder before a storm. My father's smile was the kind people mistook for warmth if they did not know better. He glanced at Jonathan, and Emma spoke of how proud he was of his youngest son and how Emma was the perfect addition to the Hayes family. The guests murmured their approval, clinking glasses softly. Then his voice shifted just slightly, as if he were about to share an intimate family story, one that was supposed to be charming but instead began to carve at the edges of my composure. He started talking about the family business, Hayes and Whitman Financial, about its legacy and the generations that had kept it thriving since his father first opened the doors in Savannah decades ago. He spoke of dedication, of building something steady and reliable, and then moved into praising Jonathan for carrying that tradition forward with skill and discipline. The applause was warm and genuine. My brother looked down modestly, his hand resting over Emma's. Then came the pivot. My father spoke about how in every family there were those who took the road most certain and those who experimented. He let the pause hang in the air long enough for heads to turn toward me. He chuckled as if indulging in a fond memory, though his eyes never softened. He mentioned that some chose to abandon what was offered to them in search of something more exciting, perhaps riskier. He said that sometimes in the pursuit of dreams, people walked away from a sure thing and found themselves learning hard lessons about the cost of ambition. The words were wrapped in civility, but the meaning was obvious. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. One man at a nearby table cleared his throat. I could feel their curiosity, their need to know exactly how badly I had failed to deserve such a mention tonight. My jaw stayed loose, my gaze steady on my father as he spun the story, positioning Jonathan as the embodiment of wisdom and me as the cautionary tale. He shared a story from years back about an internship I'd been given at Hayes and Whitman. How I had all the tools for a bright career in finance laid out before me. But after a short time, I decided to leave. He smiled at the crowd, saying how not everyone has the stomach for the discipline it takes to succeed in such an environment. The laughter was polite but thin. I caught Emma glance at me, her brows pinching slightly before she smoothed her expression. I focused on keeping my breathing even, letting my eyes sweep over the guests instead of locking on my father. In the far corner, I saw Mark Sullivan leaning back in his chair, a small smirk on his face. That told me enough about who he had been speaking to earlier. Jonathan shifted in his seat and adjusted his tie, his eyes darting briefly toward me as if to gauge my reaction. My father began to close his speech by congratulating Jonathan for being a man who understood the value of stability, commitment, and following through. The subtext dripped from every syllable. He raised his glass and the room followed the crystal ringing out across the ballroom. I lifted my own glass just enough to be polite, then set it back down untouched. As the applause swelled and he stepped away from the microphone, I felt an odd calm settle in. It was not the sharp sting I used to feel in moments like this. It was quieter, heavier, like standing in the eye of a storm, knowing the rest of it was still to come. I watched him return to the head table, basking in the glow of approval from his peers, completely unaware of the ground shifting just beneath him. The host took the stage again to move the evening forward, introducing the next toast. Conversation picked up around me, the tension diffusing as waiters glided between tables with fresh champagne. I leaned back slightly, letting the low hum of voices wash over me, but my eyes stayed locked on the stage. There was still time before the night was over, and I knew there were other parts of this performance yet to play out. 6 years earlier, I was sitting in the corner office on the 22nd floor of Hayes and Whitman Financial, staring out over the Savannah River while a stack of reports sat untouched on my desk. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the kind of smell that came with decades of business conducted in the same space. My father had made it clear that this office was a stepping stone. In his mind, I was being groomed to eventually take over, to keep the Hayes name in gold letters above the front entrance. At first, I tried to fit into the mold he carved for me. I wore the tailored suits, learned the handshake that was firm but not aggressive, memorized the names of every client who mattered. I sat in on meetings where numbers dictated every decision, where risk was measured in percentages rather than possibilities. But every day I felt the walls closing in. I was restless, caught between the security of what had been built for me and the pull of something I couldn't yet define. The breaking point came after a quarterly review meeting. My father was in rare form, praising Jonathan's progress in the investment division, while dissecting my work with the precision of a surgeon. He said I had potential but lacked focus, that I needed to stop chasing distractions. That night I stayed late at the office, not to work but to map out an idea that had been simmering for months. A platform that could transform how live events were planned and executed using real-time analytics and integrated vendor networks. It had nothing to do with traditional finance, and that was exactly the point. I brought it to him the next morning, hoping he might see the vision. He listened for maybe 2 minutes before cutting me off. He called it a side project, something I could tinker with on weekends if I really needed a hobby. I told him it wasn't a hobby. I told him I wanted to leave the firm to pursue it full time. That was the moment the air between us froze solid. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and said, "Walking away from Hayes and Whitman would be the single biggest mistake of my life." Within a month, I resigned. The news traveled fast through the family, and the reactions were swift. My mother avoided talking about it. Jonathan tried to convince me to stay, and my father treated it as if I had personally insulted the entire lineage. He didn't just think I was making a mistake. He believed I was throwing away my future and, by extension, the family's reputation. The tension peaked one Sunday afternoon during a family dinner at my parents' house. Everyone was there, including my uncles and a few cousins. We were halfway through the main course when my father put down his fork and announced to the table that his oldest son had decided to gamble his life on what he called a fragile dream. His voice was calm, almost casual, but every word was laced with judgment. Then he looked straight at me and said that in less than a year, I would be back asking for my old job, grateful to be rescued from the mess I had made. The room went silent. I felt my mother's hand tense against the tablecloth, saw Jonathan shift in his seat. I could have argued, could have laid out my plans in detail, but something told me that words would not matter. I just nodded, took a sip of water, and decided I would rather let time speak for me. The early months of ElevateX Solutions were brutal. We set up in a shared office space in Boston with 4 mismatched desks and a Wi-Fi connection that went down every other day. Our first client was a small medical conference that barely covered payroll. Every day was a scramble for leads, cold calls, and late nights writing proposals that often went unanswered. There were weeks when I wasn't sure if I would make rent, let alone prove anything to my family. But even in the struggle, there was a freedom I had never felt at Hayes and Whitman. I was building something that was mine, with people who believed in the vision even when it barely existed on paper. That belief carried me through the setbacks, though the echo of my father's prediction was never far from my mind. It became a quiet challenge I carried everywhere, a reminder that failure was not an option. Back in the present, sitting at table 14 with the clinking of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation around me, I could still hear his voice from that dinner 6 years ago. The certainty with which he had written my ending before the first chapter had even begun. Tonight he had tried again, dressing the same sentiment in a nicer suit for the benefit of his guests. But the year he had given me had stretched into 6, and I was still standing. What he didn't know yet was that the story he had been telling about me was about to change. And this time the whole room would hear it. The early months of Elevate X felt like walking a tightrope in a windstorm. Our office was a cramped corner suite in a shared workspace in Boston, wedged between a freelance design firm and a startup selling organic pet food. The walls were thin enough that I could hear our neighbors arguing about logo fonts while I tried to convince potential clients we were the future of event technology. My team was small but fierce. 4 of us, all under 30, working 12-hour days, fueled by bad coffee and the stubborn belief that we could make something out of nothing. Our first real client was a regional medical conference. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a chance to test our platform with live attendees and actual vendors. I remember the night before the event, crouched over a laptop with Chris, our lead developer, fixing a glitch in the scheduling feature, while Laura Chen, my oldest friend and the sharpest commercial lawyer I knew, reviewed the vendor contracts one more time. Laura had been with me since the idea was a sketch on a napkin, her faith in me unwavering even when the numbers looked bleak. She had this way of saying "we'll figure it out" that made it sound like a promise, not a gamble. We delivered for the medical conference, and for a moment it felt like the tide was turning. A few weeks later, we landed a much larger contract with a national marketing firm to run their annual summit. It was worth more than 6 months of our usual revenue, and I thought this was it, the moment that would silence the doubts and the whispers. We threw ourselves into the project, building custom features, hiring extra hands, and lining up suppliers. Then, 3 days before the event, I got the call. They were pulling out. A shift in strategy, they said. Budget cuts. I could hear the PR-approved regret in the project manager's voice. But all I could think about was the stack of invoices already on my desk. By that Friday, the bank account was bleeding. Vendors wanted payment. My team, who had worked nights and weekends for weeks, expected their paychecks. I could have delayed salaries, asked them to wait, but the thought of looking them in the eyes and telling them I had failed them was unbearable. So I did the only thing I could. I drained my personal savings, the money I had set aside as a safety net, and wired the payroll. Watching the balance drop to nearly zero was like having the air punched out of me. For the first time, I understood just how close we were to disappearing. Laura came by the office that night with takeout and a bottle of cheap wine. She didn't lecture me about risk management or contracts. She just sat with me in the quiet, the sound of rain tapping against the windows, and reminded me that survival was a win in itself. Chris stopped by too, dropping off a thumb drive with an idea for a new feature he thought could set us apart. That was the thing about those early days. Every setback cut deep, but the people around me refused to let the bleeding stop us. We clawed our way forward after that. Smaller events, niche conferences, anything that kept the lights on. I learned to negotiate harder, to build clauses into contracts that protected us from sudden cancellations. Laura fought for every deal like it was her own company on the line. And slowly the numbers began to shift. But the fear of another collapse never left me. It sat in the back of my mind like a shadow, a reminder that my father's prediction still hung over me, waiting for its chance to come true. Back in the ballroom tonight, the memory of that collapse felt sharper than usual. I could see Mark Sullivan near the bar, laughing with 2 other guests, his posture casual. In that way people adopt when they think they've already won. I knew Mark had been feeding my father stories about Elevate X's struggles over the years. Some of it was true, most of it wasn't, but truth didn't matter when gossip could do the damage faster. I took a slow sip of champagne and let my gaze sweep the room. Mark caught my eye for a split second before looking away too quickly to be innocent. Somewhere deep in my chest, the same resolve that carried me through those first years of the company began to rise again. I didn't need to confront him now. The night had its own timing, and the best revenge was already in motion. Mark was leaning toward my father, his hand resting casually on the back of a chair, his voice pitched low, but not low enough. I could read the easy confidence in his posture, the kind of confidence that came from knowing you had someone's ear. My father's head tilted slightly toward him, a faint smile playing on his lips as he listened. I started to move past them, not close enough to be part of the conversation, but close enough to catch pieces of it. The sound of my name broke through the din of the room, followed by the unmistakable tone of someone delivering bad news as if it were a favor. Mark was saying something about market instability, about companies like mine being the first to fold when the economy tightened. Then I heard it clearly. He told my father I would be lucky to make it to Christmas, that the kind of contracts we landed were paper thin, and that eventually the reality would catch up to me. My father didn't argue. He just nodded once, the way you do when someone confirms what you already believe. It wasn't the first time Mark had planted seeds like that. 2 years ago, he had done worse. Back when ElevateX was still struggling to find its footing, he started a rumor that we had lost our largest client and were days away from bankruptcy. I didn't even hear about it directly. A potential partner I had been negotiating with suddenly stopped returning calls, and another client canceled a renewal without explanation. By the time I traced it back, the damage had been done. Mark had a way of saying things that sounded less like gossip and more like insider information, which made them stick. That month was one of the hardest the company had faced. I remember sitting in the office with Laura, going over the books and realizing we had maybe 8 weeks before the cash flow dried up completely. That was when Jason Miller, a venture investor I had met at a tech conference, called out of the blue. He had heard about the rumors and wanted to know if they were true. I told him to meet me in person. We sat across from each other in a small cafe in Cambridge. I laid out every contract we had, every upcoming project, every dollar in the pipeline. Jason listened without interrupting, flipping through the numbers with the kind of patience only a seasoned investor has. When I finished, he leaned back and told me the numbers weren't great, but the fundamentals were strong. He said that companies survive on leadership more than spreadsheets, and that he wasn't interested in bailing out someone who would fold under pressure. I promised him I wouldn't. 2 days later, he wired us enough to stabilize operations, no strings attached except for one. He told me to remember who believed in me when the walls were closing in. Back in the present, the memory of that meeting felt like armor. I let my eyes linger on Mark for a moment longer, studying the way his lips curved when he thought he'd scored a point. My father didn't see the smirk, or maybe he didn't care. Either way, I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I turned away, heading toward the bar to refill my glass. The band had shifted into a slow jazz number, and the dance floor was filling up with couples. From across the room, I could see Jonathan and Emma moving easily together, their smiles wide and genuine. For a second, I wondered if he had any idea what Mark was saying just a few feet from him. Probably not. Jonathan never liked to get involved in the undercurrents. As I took a sip of my drink, a waiter passed by carrying a tray of champagne flutes, weaving through the crowd toward the head table. I caught a fragment of Mark's voice again over the music. The same prediction, almost word for word as 2 years ago, that I wouldn't make it to the end of the year. It was almost funny now, hearing it recycled. If only he knew that in less than an hour, every person in this room would see exactly how wrong he was. 1 week before the wedding, I was sitting in my office in Boston, the winter light slanting through the blinds, when Jason called. His tone was brisk but warm, the way it always was when he had something big on the table. He told me he was ready to commit $1.05 million to ElevateX, enough to fund our expansion into New York and secure a foothold in the largest events market in the country. The offer came with one condition. We had to sign the deal before 5 p.m. Eastern the following Saturday. Jason was flying in from London that morning in New York for less than 24 hours before heading back to Europe. His schedule was airtight. No extensions, no delays. I glanced at my calendar and felt the weight settle instantly. That Saturday was Jonathan's wedding. The ceremony was at 2, the reception stretching into the night. 5 p.m. would put me right in the middle of dinner speeches, family photos, and all the small talk I had been dreading since the invitation arrived. Missing that window meant watching the deal evaporate. Trying to explain that to my father would be pointless. In his eyes, I had already chosen business over family years ago. Laura was sitting across from me, flipping through a draft of the contract. When I told her about Jason's deadline, she didn't flinch. She simply said we could make it work. We would arrange for the documents to be reviewed ahead of time, prep a secure video link, and have Jason's legal team standing by. All I had to do was step away for 20 minutes at the right moment. The rest was logistics. The problem wasn't the mechanics, it was the optics. Walking away from my brother's reception to sign a deal would be seen exactly the way my father would want to see it. Proof that I couldn't put family first. Over the next few days, I ran the scenario through my head more times than I could count. Every version ended with me either blowing the deal or adding another brick to the wall between me and my family. But this was more than money. It was a chance to anchor ElevateX in a market that could triple our reach in a year. I couldn't let sentiment dictate strategy. Laura reminded me of something Jason had said early on. You can recover from almost any mistake in business except hesitation. By Friday afternoon, the plan was locked in. Laura would be in Boston coordinating with Jason's team in New York. I would be in Charleston blending in at the reception until just before the deadline. Then I would slip away to a quiet room sign the papers over video and return before most people noticed I was gone. It was clean, it was simple, and it was risky as hell. The morning of the wedding, I woke up in the hotel with the contract open on my laptop, going over the numbers one last time. The clauses were airtight. The funding would hit within 2 business days. It was the kind of deal that could silence every critic who had ever written me off, including the ones in my own family. But it also came with the kind of timing that made it feel like a test. Like the universe wanted to see how much I was willing to endure to get to the other side. At the ceremony, I kept my phone in my pocket, silenced but not off. Every vibration felt like a drumbeat counting down to 5 o'clock. The reception started exactly on schedule. I was seated at a table near the back, close enough to see the head table but far enough to be forgotten when the speeches began. Laura texted me at 4:15. Jason had landed, met his team, and was in a private conference room in Manhattan waiting for my call. She wanted me to be ready by 4:45 to avoid any last-minute tech issues. The band launched into an upbeat number and I checked my watch. 4:30. I stood excusing myself to a couple of distant relatives and made my way toward the hallway. The air was cooler away from the crowd, the music fading behind me. I reached the elevator and pressed the button, watching the numbers climb down slowly. In my head, I could already hear my father's voice if he noticed I was gone. Business first, family second. The same old accusation. When I reached my room, I shut the door and locked it. The laptop was already set up on the desk. The camera angled the documents queued on screen. At 4:43, I connected to the call. Jason appeared looking sharp despite the travel, his legal counsel beside him. Laura joined from Boston, her tone calm and steady as she walked us through the final points. My heart was pounding, but my voice stayed level. We moved through the clauses quickly. Initial here, sign here, confirm the wire instructions. At 4:56, Jason leaned forward, his smile breaking through the formality. "Welcome to New York," he said, and with a click the deal was done. A confirmation email hit my inbox at 4:58. 2 minutes to spare. I closed the laptop and exhaled, the adrenaline still humming in my veins. Somewhere down the hall, the reception was in full swing. I straightened my tie, picked up my champagne glass from the dresser, and prepared to walk back into the noise as if nothing had happened. The moment I stepped back into the ballroom, the warmth of the lights and the swell of music wrapped around me like a heavy coat. Laughter floated over the clink of glasses and the faint rhythm of heels moving across the polished wood floor. My table sat tucked against the far wall near the catering station, well outside the orbit of the head table. From here, the wedding looked like a picture-perfect scene, but it felt like I was watching from behind glass. I slipped into my seat and set my champagne down. Most of the people at my table were extended family I barely knew, polite enough to nod, but too engrossed in their own conversations to bother pulling me in. I glanced toward the head table. Sophia caught my eye and offered a small, genuine smile. Even across the distance, I could tell she was making an effort. She had always been kind to me in the brief times we'd met. But marrying into this family meant learning the unspoken rules, and one of them was never contradicting Richard Parker in public. She excused herself from a conversation and made her way toward me, her dress catching the light in soft ripples. When she reached the table, she rested a hand lightly on my shoulder and said it was good to see me. We exchanged a few words about the ceremony, the flowers, the band. She asked how business was going in that careful way people use when they already know the version they've been told. I gave her the short answer, the one that avoided explanations, and she nodded as if she understood. Then someone called her back and she was gone, leaving a faint trace of her perfume in the air. I checked my phone, half expecting a last-minute message from Laura or Jason, even though I knew everything was already settled. The screen stayed blank. Still, I found myself glancing at it again minutes later, an old habit that had nothing to do with the deal and everything to do with years of putting out fires before they started. A couple at the next table noticed. The woman leaned in toward her partner and said something that made him smirk. I didn't have to hear it to know the tone. The buzz of whispered comments started to spread. People noticed when you weren't fully absorbed in the festivities, especially here, especially if your absence had already been a topic of conversation. I kept my face neutral, sipping from my glass and letting my eyes drift toward the dance floor, but the weight of their sidelong glances pressed in all the same. It was then that Richard walked past. He was making his way toward the back, perhaps to speak with one of the event coordinators. But when he saw me, his stride slowed. He stopped just beside my chair, close enough that only I could hear him over the music. His voice was low and even, the kind of tone that cut more sharply than if he had raised it. "Do not embarrass us in front of our guests again, Ethan." The words slid between us like a knife, and before I could respond, he was already moving on his back straight, his focus fixed ahead. I sat very still, the echo of his words settling in my chest. Around me, the music shifted to something livelier, the kind of song that pulled people to the dance floor in pairs and small groups. Laughter-spiked cameras flashed, and for a moment it felt as though the entire room had moved on without me. I finished my champagne, set the empty glass on the table, and let the noise wash over me, holding my place in the shadows. I pushed my chair back and slipped out of the ballroom, weaving between waiters carrying trays and guests lost in conversation. The air in the hallway was cooler, quieter, a thin carpet softening my footsteps as I made my way toward the elevator. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was the reminder Laura had set 15 minutes until the call. I pressed the button for my floor and watched the doors close, sealing me away from the noise downstairs. In the room, the muted hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. I loosened my tie, set my champagne glass on the dresser, and opened my laptop. Jason's message was already waiting, the meeting link blinking at me like a green light. I clicked in my own face, appearing in the small preview box before the screen filled with Jason's office in Manhattan. Laura sat beside him, her hair pulled into a neat bun, a stack of papers at her elbow. Chloe Bennett was there too, a small camera set up on a tripod aimed at the table. She gave a little wave when she saw me. Jason leaned forward, his tone brisk but warm. "Glad you made it, Ethan. Let's get this done." Laura slid the contract into view, her pen tapping against the signature line. I read every word, even though I already knew them by heart. The deal was simple enough on paper, but huge in scope, a commitment that would push ElevateX into a new market and triple our exposure overnight. Chloe adjusted the camera angle, making sure my face and Jason's were both in frame. "This is streaming live," she said, her voice calm, practiced. "We have a few thousand viewers already, most of them industry folks." Jason grinned. "Perfect. Let's give them a show." I picked up my pen, my hand steady despite the weight of the moment. The signature flowed across the page, a few practiced loops, and then it was done. Jason reached across the table, his hand firm and sure. ElevateX Solutions has officially closed a $1.05 million deal, he said for the benefit of the camera. His grip was strong, the kind of handshake that made a statement. Chloe's camera caught it all, the angle tight on the clasp of our hands. Laura smiled, a rare, unguarded expression. "Congratulations, Ethan. You just changed the game." I felt the truth of it settling over me, not as a rush, but as a steady, grounding weight. The years of doubt, the long nights, the near misses they had led here. I thanked them both, signed off the call, and closed the laptop. For a moment I stood there in the quiet, my reflection in the dark screen looking back at me with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I straightened my jacket, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and took one last look around the room. The papers lay neatly stacked on the desk, the ink still fresh. Somewhere downstairs, music was playing and glasses were clinking. It was time to walk back into that room. I stepped back into the ballroom, letting the swell of music and chatter fold over me. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I took one without breaking stride. My eyes swept the room, catching clusters of guests leaning toward each other in conversation, some laughing too loudly, others glancing toward the head table where my father sat with Daniel and Sophia. I kept moving, aiming for my seat, when Michael Torres, the event manager, intercepted me near the center of the room. He had a small earpiece in and the tight, efficient expression of someone juggling 10 things at once. "Ethan, quick thing," he murmured. "Can you hang here for a moment? The bride's aunt wants the weather update for her drive back to Savannah, so I'm just going to throw it on the screens for a second." I nodded and stepped aside, sipping the champagne as Michael crossed to the AV station. The music dimmed, replaced by the sudden brightness of the large projection screens on either side of the stage. I expected a smiling meteorologist and a map of the southeast, but instead the screen lit up with a crisp studio shot of Chloe Bennett, her voice clear and confident. "Breaking into our regular coverage for some significant business news out of New York this afternoon." The crowd noise thinned as heads turned toward the screens. Behind Chloe, the footage rolled. Jason and I sat across from each other, the contract between us. The camera zoomed in just as I finished signing, and Jason reached across the table, his words ringing out in the ballroom as if he were standing there in person. "ElevateX Solutions has officially closed a $1.05 million deal." The handshake filled the screen, framed perfectly, the ElevateX logo in the corner. The shift in the room was almost physical. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The scattered laughter dissolved into silence, replaced by a low hum of surprise. Glasses hovered in mid-air. Eyes, dozens of them, turned toward me, tracing my every move. My father's head snapped toward the screen, then toward me, his expression flickering between disbelief and something I couldn't quite name. I stayed where I was, the champagne flute cool in my hand. The segment ran another 15 seconds, Chloe outlining the potential market impact of the deal, ElevateX's growth over the last 2 years, and the strategic push into New York. Then the music eased back in almost awkwardly as Michael scrambled to return the screens to the soft looping slideshow of engagement photos. No one moved at first. Then a few claps broke out, hesitant, polite. Sophia smiled in my direction, lifting her glass. Daniel glanced between our father and me, a strange mix of confusion and admiration in his eyes. Across the room, Mark Sullivan set his drink down, his mouth a hard line, and began edging toward the exit. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it breathe, let the reality of what they'd just seen settle in. The years of dismissal, the sideways comments, the assumptions, they all hung there exposed. I took another sip of champagne and began walking back toward my table, the path parting slightly as people stepped aside, their eyes following me the entire way. My father's voice cut through the low murmur before I could even sit down. "That's just the news trying to make something bigger than it is, Ethan." His tone was flat dismissive, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. I met his eyes briefly enough to see the flicker of uncertainty there, then pulled my chair out and sat. Daniel's smile was polite, almost strained, as if he wasn't sure whether to be proud or embarrassed. "Congratulations," he said, his voice pitched low. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her eyes warm, and offered a genuine, "You must be thrilled, Ethan." I thanked her, keeping my tone even, letting my calmness stand in contrast to my father's stiffness. Mark Sullivan moved along the edge of the room, heading for the exit with a sudden urgency. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. I could feel the weight of his avoidance, the way some people disappear when the narrative they've been pushing collapses. I stayed at the table, answering the occasional question from nearby guests about ElevateX, brushing off the more pointed ones about why I hadn't stayed in the family business. My father didn't say much after his first remark. He kept his gaze fixed on the stage, his fingers drumming lightly against the tablecloth, his wine glass untouched. The rest of the dinner passed in an odd, suspended rhythm. People spoke to me more than they had all night, yet there was a hesitance in their approach, as if they were recalibrating in real time. I smiled when appropriate, answered without embellishment, and turned the conversation back to them whenever I could. At one point, Daniel leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've really built something." I just nodded, not trusting myself to say more. Sophia reached under the table to squeeze his hand. Her glance toward me filled with something seener than pity, more like understanding. By dessert, my father had stopped trying to make small talk with the people around him. His silence spoke louder than any of his earlier comments. When coffee was served, he excused himself from the table, muttering something about checking on a guest outside. I didn't watch him go. The band picked up again, couples drifting toward the dance floor. I stayed seated for a while, the hum of conversation and the clink of silverware fading into the background. Across the room, Mark was nowhere to be seen. The space he left behind felt almost as telling as his presence had earlier. I pushed my chair back and stood, offering a polite nod to a couple of my father's business associates who were watching me too closely. I moved toward the bar, feeling the shift in the air around me, the way the narrative of the night had changed but not yet settled. I had barely taken a sip of the bourbon when I saw my father moving toward me through the thinning crowd. His shoulders were squared, his mouth a tight line, but there was no trace of the public mask he wore earlier. He stopped a few feet away and waited until the last of the guests nearby had turned back to their conversations. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I set my glass down, following him toward a side corridor that led to the patio. The noise of the reception faded behind us, replaced by the distant crash of the Atlantic and the muffled thump of bass from inside. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets as if searching for the right entry point. Finally, he looked me in the eye. "I may have been wrong about you." The words were clipped, measured, like each one cost him something. I didn't respond right away. The ocean air was cool on my face, and for a moment I just let him stand in that sense. "You built something real," he continued. "I didn't see it before. I thought you were chasing a dream that didn't mean anything." His jaw flexed. "Clearly, I underestimated you." I leaned back against the railing, watching him. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, Dad, or to Daniel, or anyone else. I just wanted to build something on my own terms." He nodded once slowly, though I could tell he didn't agree entirely. "You still walked away from security, from a legacy." I smiled faintly. "Your legacy, not mine." The words hung between us, not sharp but undeniable. He shifted his weight, looking past me toward the dark water. "Maybe, but I still believe family should stick together." "We haven't exactly made that easy," I said. His gaze came back to mine, steady now. "I can't promise I'll understand all your choices, but tonight, you showed me something I didn't expect." For a man like my father, it was as close to an admission of fault as I'd ever get. I pushed off the railing, closing the space between us. His hand extended, firm and deliberate. It had been years since he'd offered it without ceremony or expectation. I took it, feeling the grip of someone who had spent a lifetime defining strength in narrow terms. No apology, no sweeping reconciliation, just a handshake heavy with things left unsaid. We stood there a few seconds longer before he released his hold. He glanced back toward the glowing ballroom windows, the muffled laughter spilling out. "You should get back in there," he said. "I will," I replied, watching as he turned and walked ahead of me. His stride steady, but his shoulders no longer quite as rigid. The morning after the wedding, I packed my suitcase in the quiet of my hotel room. The air smelled faintly of salt from the open balcony door, and the sun was just beginning to burn off the haze over the water. Charleston was waking up slowly, but my mind was already miles north. I zipped the bag shut, slipped my phone into my jacket pocket, and wheeled everything down to the lobby without looking back at the reception hall where the night before had played out. The drive to the airport was calm. The streets nearly empty except for a few joggers and shop owners pulling up their gates. I checked my email once just to see Jason's confirmation that the wire transfer had cleared. The number sat there on the screen, more than just money. It was proof that the years of grinding, doubting, and rebuilding had been worth it. On the plane, I sat by the window watching the coastline shrink into the horizon. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of needing to prove anything. My thoughts drifted back to the years I had spent trying to measure up to a version of success I never wanted in the first place. The endless dinners where my choices were dissected like business case studies. The quiet dismissals, the side comments, the looks that said I'd wasted my potential. All of that felt smaller now. Not gone, but diminished in the light of what I had built. I thought about my team back in Boston, the four of us crammed into that tiny office with a single rattling air conditioner. I thought about Laura, who had believed in me before the contracts were big enough to matter, and Jason, who had bet on me when most people wouldn't return my calls. Somewhere over the clouds, I realized that the victory wasn't the $1 million deal or the sudden shift in how people looked at me. It was that I had stayed on my own path even when it was lonelier and harder than I expected. I had endured the nights staring at my bank account, wondering if I could make payroll, the mornings where quitting would have been the easiest thing to do. Landing in Boston felt different. The air was colder, the pace faster, but it was home. I grabbed my bag, hailed a cab, and watched the city come into view through the glass. The streets were familiar, but I carried myself differently walking back into my office. My team was there, grinning, coffee in hand, ready to hear how it all went. I just smiled and told them we had work to do. That night, back in my apartment, I stood by the window looking out at the city lights. I thought about my father, about the handshake that wasn't an apology but might have been the closest thing I would ever get. I thought about Daniel and Sophia starting their new life and how weddings are meant to mark beginnings. For me, it felt like the closing of a chapter I had been carrying for years. Success, I realized, isn't about the applause or the headlines or the dollar amounts. It is about the quiet certainty that you are exactly where you're meant to be, living by values you can stand by when no one else is watching. If you've ever been told you wouldn't make it, if you've ever been underestimated or written off, you know how that fire burns. You know how it feels to want to prove them wrong, but more importantly, to prove yourself right. I'd love to hear your story. Share a time when someone misjudged you and how you turned it around. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or flashy. It's living a life they can't ignore.